Welcome to Episode 4 of Origins. This episode dives into Section 3 of Friedrich Engels' groundbreaking work, The Iroquois Gens. Today, we uncover how this ancient kinship system, rooted in equality and cooperation, reveals a powerful model of social organization long before the rise of class-based states.
Absolutely. We're really getting into the weeds of Engels' analysis here.
We are. We've touched on Engels before, but this time it's all about his look at the Iroquois, straight from his book, Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State.
Right, specifically that section on the Iroquois Gens.
Exactly. We're focusing on Lewis Henry Morgan's discoveries, which Engels leaned on heavily, and what they show us about, well, the basics of society before states even existed.
Yeah, how people organized themselves way back when.
So get ready, because terms like gens and phratries might start to look a bit different after this. Let's dive in.
Okay, so Morgan's work was really a game changer for understanding ancient history.
How so? What was known before him?
Well, people knew about the Greek genia and their Roman gentes. They knew there were, kinship groups based on family lines.
Okay, sort of like clans or extended families?
Kind of, but their precise role and structure, especially in the earliest times, was still pretty hazy.
Right.
Then Morgan comes along. He'd spent years studying the Iroquois and other Native American groups, living with them, learning their social systems.
And he found connections.
Big time.
Right.
He basically proved that their kinship structures, their gen system, was fundamentally the same as the ancient Greek and Roman ones.
Wow. Not just similar, but the same basic pattern.
Essentially identical in principle. And this wasn't just a parallel. Morgan argued, and Engels agreed, that the American form was likely the original form.
The original. So the Greek and Roman versions were derived from that older pattern.
That was the implication. It was huge because it suggested you could look at living societies, like the Iroquois, to understand the deep past of Europe.
So it wasn't just about Native American history. It suddenly unlocked doors for ancient Greek and Roman history, too.
Exactly. It clarified a lot about their archaic periods. And maybe even more importantly, it gave a concrete picture of how societies functioned before the state emerged.
A society organized around kinship, not territory or, government buildings.
Precisely, based on lineage. And the name itself tells you something.
Gens.
Yeah, both the Latin gens and the Greek genos come from a root word, gan.
Which means?
To beget, to create, to give birth. So it's fundamentally about descent, about bloodlines, real or perceived.
Okay, so lineage is key. Now, the source makes a big point about how lineage was traced initially, not through the father.
Right. Engels, following Morgan, argues that the original gens was based on mother right.
Mother right, meaning descent is traced through the female line.
Exactly. This connects back to earlier hypothesized stages of family structure, like the Punaluan family, where group marriage might have made paternity uncertain.
Ah, okay. So the only definite line was through the mother.
Pretty much. If you don't know for sure who the father is, the mother is the clear anchor point for lineage.
So how did that rule actually shape the gens?
Well, think about it. Men had to marry outside their own gens. That's exogamy. We'll get back to that.
Right.
So a man's children belong to his wife's gens, not his own.
I see.
Only the children of the daughters within the gens remain members of that same gens.
So the women carried the gens line forward.
Yes. That seemingly simple rule had massive implications for membership, inheritance, everything.
And the Iroquois, specifically the Seneca tribe, are kind of the textbook example.
They're presented as the classic form, yeah. Engels lists the 8 Seneca gentes: wolf, bear, turtle, beaver, and so on. Animal names.
And these weren't just names. They were functioning units with real power and rules.
Absolutely. Engels details this whole set of rights, duties, and privileges that made the gens a really powerful sort of self-governing entity within the larger tribe.
Okay, let's break those down. Leadership, for instance. How did that work?
Each gens elected its own leaders. There were 2 main types. The sachem, who was like the peace chief, then the war chief. The sachem had to be chosen from within the gens.
And was it hereditary, like passing from father to son?
Sort of, but not quite like we think of it. It was hereditary within the gens, but because of mother right, it usually passed to the deceased sachem's brother, or maybe his sister's son. Never his own son, because the son belonged to a different gens.
Fascinating. So who did the electing?
This is really interesting. All adult members of the gens, men and women, had a vote.
Women, too, in electing chiefs.
Yep. Equal voice. And they didn't just elect them, they could also depose them.
Really? So if a leader wasn't doing a good job?
The gens could vote them out. The men and women who elected them held the power to remove them. The tribal council could also do this.
And what happened to a deposed chief?
They just became a regular member of the gens again. No permanent rank, just back to being an ordinary warrior or community member.
That's a remarkable level of accountability.
Yeah.
Very democratic in a way.
Extremely. It kept leaders tied closely to the will of their community.
Okay, besides leadership, what was like the absolute core rule?
Exogamy. Engels calls it the fundamental law. You absolutely, positively could not marry someone from within your own gens.
Why was that so fundamental?
Because it defined the boundary of the gens. It was based on the idea of shared blood, however far back. Marrying within was unthinkable, like marrying a sister. Morgan figuring this out was key. Apparently, it had confused earlier anthropologists.
So the rule wasn't just a preference, it was strictly enforced.
Totally. It was the bond that held the gens together. Without it, the whole structure would dissolve.
Okay, if you marry outside the gens, what about property when someone dies? That's always complicated.
It stayed within the gens, and again, mother right dictates how.
So not to the spouse or children necessarily?
Nope. A man's property wouldn't go to his wife or his kids because they belonged to other gens. It would go to his own Gentile relatives, his brothers, his sisters, maybe his maternal uncle.
And a woman's property.
That would go to her children because they were in her gens, or to her sisters.
So the gens tie trumped the immediate family tie in terms of inheritance.
Absolutely. It really shows how central the gens was to everything.
What about day-to-day life, like helping each other out?
Oh, definitely. There was a strong obligation of mutual aid and protection. If you were a member of the wolf gens, say, all other wolves had your back. Your security came from the whole group.
And that extended to seeking justice if someone was harmed.
Yes, and this leads to the concept of blood revenge.
Uh-oh. Sounds serious.
It was. If someone from outside the gens killed a member, the victim's gens was obligated to seek revenge. It was a collective duty.
Was it just immediate violence?
Not always. There was a process. The Council of the Slayer's gens would usually offer atonement first, regrets, gifts, that sort of thing to the Council of the Slain Person's gens.
A chance to smooth things over.
Right. If the atonement was accepted, the matter was settled peacefully. If not,
Then revenge.
then the slain person's gens would appoint avengers. If they succeeded in killing someone from the offending gens, the score was considered even. It was pretty grim calculus, but it was a system.
A system of collective responsibility. Were there other ways to know who belonged to which gens?
Yeah, names were important. Each gens had its own set of personal names, and having one of those names signified your membership and rights.
And could outsiders ever join?
Yes, adoption was a big thing. They could adopt strangers, even prisoners of war, into the gens.
And they got full rights.
Full rights. Became a member of the gens and therefore the tribe. It often involved a ceremony, sometimes confirmed by the tribal council. They even did mass adoption sometimes if a gens needed more members.
What about religion? Was that tied to the gens?
Often, yes. Specific ceremonies might be linked to the gens, and the sachems and war chiefs sometimes acted as religious leaders or keepers of the faith during festivals.
And burial, did they have separate areas?
They had a common burial place for the gens. Engels mentions the Tuscarora practice where mothers were buried with their children, but fathers separately, again reflecting that mother right system. The whole gens would participate in the funeral rites.
So taking all that together, elections, depositions, marriage rules, inheritance, mutual aid, revenge, names, adoption, religion, burial. The gens was really a complete social unit.
It governed almost every aspect of life for its members. It was the fundamental building block.
And Engels pulls out some core values from this structure, right? Liberty.
Liberty, equality, and fraternity. He says these were the cardinal principles, even if they weren't written down like a constitution.
It sounds almost utopian. Liberty, equality, fraternity, centuries before the French Revolution.
Well, within the context of that society, yes. Members were personally free. Equal in rights chiefs didn't have special privileges, just duties, and bound by these incredibly strong kinship ties.
And Engels links this directly to the character of the people.
He does. He attributes the sense of personal dignity, independence, and strength, often observed in Native Americans, directly to living within this kind of egalitarian, kin-based structure.
It's a powerful idea that social structure shapes character so profoundly. Okay, so the gens is the base unit. Were there layers above that?
Yes. The next layer up was the phratry. Basically, a group of related gentes.
Related how?
Often, a phratry might have started as one large original gens that then split into several daughter gentes over time. So the gentes within a phratry saw each other as closer kin, like brother gentes.
And they interacted with other phratries.
Yeah, they might call gentes in another phratry cousin gentes. Phratries had specific functions, sometimes social, like playing games against each other.
Like rival sports teams.
Kind of. They also had roles in tribal councils, sometimes religious functions, and even in things like burials. Maybe the opposite phratry handled the funeral arrangements for important figures.
Do they fight together?
Sometimes they could function as military units too, yeah.
Okay, so gens, then phratry. What's next?
The tribe. A tribe was made up of several phratries, or sometimes just a collection of gentes if phratries hadn't formed or were less important.
What defined a tribe?
A few key things. They usually had their own territory, although boundaries might be fluid. They had a tribal name. A distinct dialect language was closely tied to tribe.
And a tribal government.
Yes, centered around the tribal council. This council had the ultimate authority to install or depose the sachems and war chiefs elected by the gentes.
So the tribe confirmed the gens' choices.
Right, providing a layer of broader tribal oversight. The tribe also shared common religious beliefs, myths, festivals.
Tell me more about this tribal council. Who was on it?
It was composed of all the sachems and war chiefs from all the gentes in the tribe.
And since they could be deposed.
It meant the council was genuinely representative of the gentes, not some entrenched aristocracy.
How did it operate? Were meetings secret?
No, quite the opposite. Deliberations were public. And here's another amazing thing. Anyone from the tribe, any member, could attend the council and speak their mind.
Anyone, even if they weren't a chief.
Yep, women usually spoke through a male representative they chose, but their voices could be heard.
But who made the final decision?
The decision rested with the council members, the sachems, and chiefs.
And how did they decide? Majority vote?
Here's where the Iroquois were apparently quite distinctive. For the Iroquois Tribal Council, decisions had to be unanimous.
Unanimous. Again, like every single chief had to agree.
That's what Engels reports based on Morgan. It must have required incredible patience and commitment to consensus.
How did they manage that, especially for big things like going to war?
It suggests a political culture deeply focused on maintaining harmony and ensuring everyone was on board. It probably involved a lot of discussion and persuasion. The council handled the big decisions: war, peace, treaties.
What about actual fighting? Was it centrally commanded?
Often, war parties were more spontaneous. Someone might announce a raid with a war dance, and whoever joined the dance was in. Smaller scale stuff. Larger campaigns needed more coordination, obviously.
Was there a single big chief for the whole tribe?
Sometimes there was a figure recognized as a head chief, but Engels suggests their actual power was usually quite limited. It wasn't like a king. Authority really rested with the council.
Okay, so we have gens, phratry, tribe, and the Iroquois took it one step further, didn't they?
They did. They formed the Iroquois Confederacy, or the League of the Iroquois. This was where related tribes formed a permanent federation.
The famous Five Nations, Senecas, Cayugas, Onondagas, Oneidas, Mohawks, later Six Nations when the Tuscarora joined.
Exactly. Engels presents this as the peak of social organization achieved by people at this specific stage of development, what he calls lower barbarism, formed sometime in the 15th century, located in what's now New York State.
What was the basis of the League?
It was built on the foundation of the tribes being related. They shared many of the same gentes, linking them through kinship across tribal lines. And importantly, it was founded on the complete equality and independence of each member tribe.
No single tribe dominated the others.
Nope. Equality was key. The Confederacy had its own council, the Federal Council.
How many members?
50 sachems in total, representing the different tribes and their gentes, but all holding equal rank and authority within the council.
And these federal sachems, were they elected?
They were chosen by the gentes, just like the tribal sachems, and could be deposed by them. But their official installation, their investiture into the Federal Council, was done by the council itself.
Okay, another check and balance. Let me guess. Unanimity required here, too.
You got it. Absolute unanimity was required for any decision by the Federal Council.
How did that even work? Did they vote by individual sachem or by tribe?
They voted by tribe. Each tribe had to reach internal unanimity among its sachems first, and then all 5 tribes had to agree.
That's just mind-boggling from a modern perspective. How could they function like that for centuries?
It points to a fundamentally different approach to governance. prioritizing consensus over speed or majority rule. It's quite remarkable.
Could the Federal Council call its own meetings?
Interestingly, no. Only a tribal council could convene the federal council. The central body couldn't initiate its own sessions, another limit on central power.
And was there a president of the Confederacy?
A head of state. According to Engels' account, absolutely not. No single chief executive. They had 2 supreme war chiefs with equal powers for military matters, but no overall civil leader.
So this entire complex structure, gens, phratry, tribe, confederacy, operated for hundreds of years without a state.
That's the core argument. No state apparatus as we know it, no soldiers separate from the people, no police force, no nobles, kings, governors, judges in courts, prisons, lawsuits in the way we understand them.
How did anything get done? How was their order?
Through the power of custom, tradition, public opinion, and the inherent structures of the gens, tribe, and councils, decisions were made collectively and order was maintained by the community itself. Engels calls it a wonderful constitution in its simplicity and adaptation to its conditions.
And this was tied to a communal way of living.
Deeply. Households often involve several families living and working together. Land belonged to the tribe. Gardens were allotted to families temporarily. Resources were shared. According to Engels, it meant there were no poor or needy in the way later societies have them. The community, the gens, took collective responsibility for the elderly, the sick, those unable to provide for themselves.
And everyone was equal and free.
That's the claim. Equal rights, personal freedom, including for women. Slavery wasn't really a feature. Even conquered tribes were typically offered adoption into the league first.
Engels really emphasizes the kind of people this system produced.
Yes, he talks about their dignity, integrity, independence, courage qualities admired even by their adversaries. He draws parallels to other groups like Zulus, suggesting this character stems from the strength of these Gentile communal institutions.
And he draws a stark contrast with modern society.
A huge one. He sees a massive gulf separating the free, equal member of the old Gentile society from the average person in what he terms civilized society.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
Yeah.
He also says this whole amazing system was doomed.
No. He does. Despite admiring its internal structure, he argues it had inherent limitations. It was largely confined to the tribe or the confederacy. Outside that, you were outside the law. This led to constant warfare, sometimes brutal.
And it was tied to a specific economic stage.
Yes, he believed it could only exist with relatively undeveloped production and a small, scattered population. The individual was completely bound to the community, almost part of a collective organism.
And for society to develop further, in his view.
That tight communal bond had to be broken. The power of the primitive community needed to be shattered.
How does he describe that breaking process? It sounds quite negative.
Extremely negative. He uses terms like degradation. He argues it was driven by the lowest interests, greed, avarice, selfish desires for wealth and property, and accomplished by the vilest means: theft, violence, deceit, treason.
So he sees the fall of this older system not just as a historical change, but as driven by negative human impulses, ushering in a new era.
Exactly. This is where his specific historical theory comes in strongly. He argues these forces destroyed the old communal bonds and ushered in the new civilized class society.
A society based on private property and exploitation, in his view.
Precisely. He concludes very starkly that this new form of society for the past 2,500 years has meant the development of a ruling minority at the expense of the vast exploited majority, and that this situation was, in his time, more than ever before. It's a powerful critique tied directly to his analysis of the fall of the Gentile constitution.
Wow. Okay, so we've really journeyed through Engels' view of the Iroquois system from the mother-right gens up through the phratry, the tribe, and finally the stateless confederacy.
And seen that incredible contrast he paints. The equality, freedom, and community focus of the Gentile society versus the class divisions and, in his view, exploitative nature of the state-based society that replaced it.
It definitely leaves you thinking. Does the complexity and, let's face it, the productive power of modern state societies mean we have to sacrifice that fundamental equality and freedom that Engels saw in the Iroquois gens?
Or, perhaps, are there principles from those older forms, consensus building, communal responsibility, maybe even the accountability of leaders that we could learn from or adapt as we think about what a truly just and equitable society looks like today?
That's the provocative thought to ponder. Can we have both complexity and that deep sense of equality? A fascinating question rooted in this look at the deep past.
It certainly makes you reconsider the foundations of social organization.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.